Welcome to this adaptation planning workshop. This is our first workshop and I'm so impressed with such good attendance. Great job, guys. So this afternoon we're here to have a discussion and dialogue regarding adaptation planning. And we have representatives from elected officials, agency staff, practitioners, and interested parties. So we're going to engage in a very good conversation. Again, my name is Sandy Wong, and I'm the Executive Director of CCAG. For those of you who don't know much about CCAG, it's a 21-member agency. We serve the county of San Mateo and the 20 cities within that county. CCAG as an agency wears many hats. One of the hats is climate protection. In doing that, we serve our member agencies and assist them in doing climate action planning and implementation. And we also partnered with Joint Venture Silicon Valley in doing some of those works. We've hosted workshops and we've helped cities in developing their climate action plans. And one of the significant accomplishments we've achieved is developing something called the RICAP tool. It stands for Regionally Integrated Climate Action Planning Suite. It's a tool that helps cities in doing climate action plans and tracking of their performance measures in the future. Today's workshop is a collaboration between CCAG of the County of San Mateo and Joint Venture Silicon Valley. And I'd like to recognize and thank those who put their hard work in this workshop, and that's Susan Wright and Kim Springer. They both work for the County of San Mateo. And Kara Rose, who's with the Joint Venture Silicon Valley, right there. And we also want to thank the CCAG RMCP committee, the Regional Resource Management Climate Protection Committee, sorry about that, for their valuable input in giving the committee to prepare the work program, especially the elected officials in that committee. And they are Deborah Gordon from Woodside, Barbara Pierce from Redwood City, Dave Pine on the Board of Supervisors, Marianne Moyes-Durbin from Portola Valley, and Pedro Gonzalez from South San Francisco. And in our audience today, I do see one elected official sitting way back there, Sue DeGree from City of Pacifica.
And Michael from Burlingame.
Michael from Burlingame. Thank you very much for your leadership and your support in this workshop. And I would like to introduce Kim Springer, who's going to give us an overview of this afternoon's workshop.
So as they said, I don't know how many of you have been to the Sbravo Center before, but this is a wonderful workshop room with fantastic production, good sound, 2 screens, the whole thing. So again, we're sort of adapting here. Still a very nice place, and thanks for being here. So I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to speak on something that's kind of at the front edge of things, and you have so many things you want to say, but at the same time that you're saying them that the environment around it is changing. And I don't mean climate change, I mean new ways to look at adaptation planning, and different things are going on continuously. So I'm going to kind of give maybe a little bit of a hit of where we are right now. So really the purpose of this meeting is to take a look at a few different things, and majorly really to provide input to a regional effort that's going on. But in 2012, there was more noise about adaptation planning happening than I had ever heard about before. There were more things going on about weather events. There was more emphasis from the state on adaptation, more breakout sessions and other workshops and retreats. Hickley was more involved in developing some tools. And part of what we want to do is kind of help clarify with some discussions and examples what are some of the risks that are more specific to San Mateo County and the region, that most approaches to adaptation planning have some similar elements, and to find out more about what's being discussed in adaptation in your organizations, because that's important for us to know to sort of help support the regional discussion. Ultimately, some of the things that we shared today are going to be part of a discussion that's happening in about a week, and I guess Bruce probably will talk a little bit more about that. In the process of developing plans, so there are, different approaches that we've seen. They all, in some ways, sort of boil down to the same kind of approach in general. And once you have sort of an understanding of the regional risks that come from climate science, then you start to think in terms of, okay, so what are your vulnerable assets? And you may think in terms of what are your local government assets and what might be your community assets. And a lot of these assets, you start to take a look at what are the risks that are associated with climate change to those assets. And then you might want to start looking at what kind of planning documents may already exist that include some of those assets. And so, anybody have an idea or shout out something that would be considered a local government asset? Anybody? Port of anything? Say again?
Redwood City Port.
Port of Redwood City, right? How about a wastewater treatment plant? How about a repeater station tower? Any other ideas?
Water tanks.
Water tanks, okay. Some of those local government in terms of community assets.
Freeway.
Freeways,
Hospitals.
hospitals,
Parks.
say again?
Parks.
Parks, that's right. Okay, residential areas,
Well, for us, 1/3 of our tax base, which is the hotels.
okay, the hotels, okay. So those are some of the things that you start to think about. And then when you start to think in terms of the plans, some of the plans that may be associated with some of those areas or assets, may not all be the same. So they may not fit the adaptation perfectly, and there are a couple of reasons why. So I think the important thing that we kind of wanted to get across was, we're thinking, oh my gosh, we put together a workshop, and maybe some of the cities are going to think, oh my gosh, there's all this work that needs to be done, and maybe ultimately there will be, but that's not what we're talking about today, is necessarily starting a whole process. We're just kind of taking a look at adaptation and finding out a little bit more what's going on the regional level. When you look at these different kinds of plans, there some examples would be general plans, hazard mitigation plans, health department plans for specific resources like water planning, climate action plan, although it's important to note that climate action plan and an adaptation plan are not the same thing. A lot of climate action plans include adaptation plans, so they can be sort of tied together. But there may be some gaps in the plans, and maybe some of these plans don't include really adaptation elements at all. They may sort of address the assets, but they may not include the adaptation at all. And some of them may be sort of focused more on emergencies as opposed to really kind of planning ahead for things that are going to come down in the future. And another point is that some of these plans may historically have had different stakeholders that gave input to the development of the plan. And when you add adaptation into it, that may change the look of it somewhat. So, and I think one of the last things to put out here, and I think that's part of the reason we're having this discussion today, is that, forests don't really stop at city lines, and highways don't stop at city lines, and shorelines don't stop at city or even county lines. So it's really important to have a discussion regionally, and so I think that's kind of the main point of why we're here today. So with that, and not having an agenda, I will go ahead and introduce David Ackley.
Yes.
I'm David Ackerley. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley. And it's good to see in the real world nothing changes. No one sits in the front. So I'm a biologist. I'm an ecologist and conservation biologist. And my research in the last few years has turned to climate change impacts. And I've focused very much in the Bay Area recently. And as part of that, and getting engaged in these discussions, what I want to present today is not just one professor's research, which we could easily fill 25 minutes, but would not do justice to the topic. But I've just really tried to tackle, drawing information from a lot of my colleagues, from a lot of the work that's being done at the state and the regional level, and put it together in a very quick overview of climate change impacts, touching on some of the adaptation issues. And a couple things to start with. The term adaptation is very useful. It's got a very important meaning here. But what can we do to minimize the impacts of changing climate? And it's contrasted with mitigation. And mitigation is everything we can do to slow down the rate of climate change. So most attention, and certainly most legislative action, has gone to mitigation issues, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, also renewable energy, electric cars, and all those emissions. Maybe the single most important takeaway is not that these are not, first of all, they're not alternatives. It's not an either-or proposition. If we stop all fossil fuel burning today, climate will continue to change, and adaptation will still be important. Conditions will change. And on the other hand, there's been fear that by embracing adaptation, it's just throwing up our hands and saying, first of all, saying, we can deal with it. We don't have to worry about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's by no means the case, because none of these issues are easy to deal with. But also, it's not an either-or, and as you'll see, a lot of the actions that really come to the fore from the research can serve both purposes, of both trying to slow down the rate of climate change and trying to deal with it when it comes, which is essentially inevitable. So the background here is carbon dioxide is rising in the atmosphere. This is not new information. Temperature is rising. But a lot of the issues we'll talk about are really around water. And in terms of how it impacts us as human societies and ecosystems, temperature and water are really intimately related. And while temperature is on this fairly inexorable rise over hot years and cold years, water is a much, much more difficult issue. Just much more variable spatially and temporally, and much more complex the way it plays out. So a lot of the discussion will be around water. So I want to touch on three broad areas. The first is lower right there is just freshwater supplies for when they'll be impacted in California. The top middle is actually indicating a suite of things that are not normally on the top of people's list, but once you start digging down, agriculture, ecosystems, wildfire, some of the other issues, especially in terrestrial landscapes, which is where a lot of my work is. And then at the end, come to the sea level rise, which is, I think, at the top of a lot of people's lists for very good reasons. And there's plenty to discuss there. I should just say right up front, it is not my primary expertise. So of course we should just get right out of the table. But I'm by no means the latest Bay Area expert on sea level rise problems. But we've been having lots of discussions, and there's lots of material to draw on. So no news to people here about the issues around water. Of course, the Bay Area, our water supplies come largely from the Sierra Nevada and here in San Mateo County. It's tied into the Hetch-Hetchy, so coming out of the Yosemite watershed. For other parts of the state, it could be other parts of the Sierra, and of course some from the Colorado River or the North Coast. Again, familiar territory here. The way we store water to get through our long Mediterranean climate summer drought, we store it in reservoirs and we store it in snow. And if it wasn't for all that water stored in snow, we'd have a hard time getting through the summer and serving all the agricultural and urban needs. And if there is one direct impact of a warming climate, which is essentially impossible to avoid, is simply less snowpack. More precipitation will fall as rain going into the fall. Less will fall as snow, and then it will start falling again as rain more in the spring. It'll be rain at lower elevations. If it falls as rain in winter, comes down the rivers, reservoirs may be full. If we're lucky, the reservoirs are full. In which case that water can't be stored, and it flows out through the Golden Gate. Very good for the Delta, potentially, to have those freshwater flows, but it means it's not in the snowpack from June, July, August, and feeding into the reservoirs as it moves. So just that reduction in the storage capacity is probably the biggest direct impact on water supplies And, you know, and again, so this leads them right to, okay, what's an adaptation action? Well, it's a very familiar one. All water conservation strategies are climate adaptation. And I think one thing I hope you take away from this is that a lot of the things that start coming up on the list of adaptation strategies are not new ideas. They're not new, and they're not only good ideas because of climate. They're good ideas already for lots of reasons. So climate adaptation is not a whole new list of things to add along with all the other things that we're all struggling with already. A lot of them just become even more compelling, even more important in the face of changing conditions. And I won't go into any more detail on water supply issues, and I'm sure I know there are experts here who, you know, again, these we can come back for discussion. The paradox of climate change is there's less water, there's also more water. Storms become more intense. We're seeing that in real time in the last couple of years. So while there may be less summer water, we also may have more intense storms. Here's examples where the top flood years in the American River fought the top flood years in the last century, coming in the last part of the century, so coming more recently. And if we continue on these kinds of trends, we're also contending with increased flooding in terms of local rainfall. One thing that you may have heard before, and it continues to be true in the research, we know temperatures are warming due to greenhouse gas emissions. We really don't know whether there will be more rainfall or less rainfall, just in terms of actual mean annual precipitation. The available climate models still for California span positive and negative. So we don't know that we're preparing for more or less, just in terms of total rainfall. And the models have yet to come any greater consensus around that. So that's still kind of wide open, which would be especially related to flooding problems. So when we look at combining, we haven't talked sea level rises in the background here. Clearly, a lot of flooding issues are exacerbated when floodwaters from freshwater systems meet the bay, if we have rising sea level as well, in terms of the flooding that we see along the coast, and then those have to be put into a broader context of all of the other things influencing water flows, where the water is disposed of and handled. Another thing that is very difficult issue for climate models to handle is to really understand individual storms. There's been a very rapid increase in understanding about how storms hit California in the last few years. And the notion of atmospheric rivers, you may have heard that term, that a lot of our precipitation comes in these just streams of precipitation that come and hit one part of the coast in one storm, maybe another part in another storm. And understanding the dynamics of those is very much an active area in climate research. So flooding in the lower left, of course, one of the real, not an immediate issue for San Mateo County, except in the ways it would disrupt all of our water supplies. But levee breaks in the delta and disruptions to water movement through the delta are, of course, very, very high on the issue at the state level for water systems. And then high storm events, of course, can cause very local disruption in terms of flooding damage. So the second part, I just want to sort of hit some highlights, and not necessarily in a positive sense all the time, but other issues which may not be at the top of the agenda. And this is just to feed a discussion, just to start thinking about some of the range of impacts. Agriculture, ecosystems and biodiversity, wildfire, human health issues, and how this may play out in terms of Bay Area population growth, how climate could impact it. And then really at the end, touching on quality of life, which in some ways wraps up all of this into sort of all comes together in terms of what people are seeking and why we have so many people living. So agriculture at the Bay Area level, agriculture is about a $2 billion industry, and half of that is wine, not surprisingly. A lot of the rest is grazing and animal products. Now the wine industry is not as big on the peninsula here, obviously, as it is in the North Bay, but that's just for now, because actually, as climates warm and the hot temperatures that favor the high quality wines, those hot temperature conditions actually move towards the coast. So one of the persistent themes we see is the influence of the ocean is so strong, as we all know, temperatures are so much cooler near the coast, that as climate warms, one way to think about climate change is that the interior climates are moving towards the coast. You can think of changing time as really being a movement in space. One of the things that comes from that is actually scenarios where San Mateo County becomes the location of the highest quality wine production. So there might be a bright side here. Now, whether the right soils and all the other things that vineyards are looking for are out there, that's an open question. But to be serious about this, agriculturalists are very proactive. this is an industry which is intensely wedded to rainfall and temperature, and they're not waiting by any means. We've already heard that the vineyards are either purchasing land or beginning to change varietals or moving up towards Clear Lake, buying land in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. The California vineyards are very attentive to where climate is going to move and what it will mean for the shifts in their industry. And the same in the Central Valley, for Central Valley agriculture. So my own real passion is around open space conservation. And here, San Mateo County is well, actually almost all the Bay Area, but a place with incredible resources as soon as you get past 280 up into the open space. And one thing I've been working with the Bay Area Open Space Council on incorporating climate change into their conservation planning. Some of you may have seen this. This is the blue areas on this map are an analysis of those areas which, if they could be protected as permanent open space, give the most value in terms of long-term conservation planning for the region. And then a lot of the surrounding areas are either urbanized or agriculture. But we're now working on plans to try to, this work was done without thinking about changing climate, changing conditions. And we're working back through that analysis to think about whether any of those priorities would shift. In large measure, they may not shift a lot. You know, conserving open space and conserving large areas of open space is a key priority, whether conditions change or not. And that doesn't necessarily give a real shift in that focus. But certainly large protected areas become increasingly valuable if conditions are changing and ecosystems are moving around, plants and animals are moving around. A fragmented park system is much more vulnerable in terms of conservation. My own work is on vegetation modeling, and there's still a lot of uncertainty in doing this, a lot of factors we can't incorporate. But if you know the chaparral and the hillsides, especially the chaparral is of course the most flammable of our local ecosystems, the shrublands that cover a lot of the hillsides here. That's a dry adapted vegetation. It's much more common in Southern California, and at least on the scale of decades or maybe into the next century, we would expect chaparral to spread and become much more common across the Bay Area than it is now. Conditions get hotter and drier. The plants that live here will be plants that adapt to the hotter and drier conditions. But for those kinds of vegetation changes to occur, they may occur following major droughts. We know that during major droughts, we see a lot of tree mortality. This is something that's been seen in Arizona, it's been seen in a lot of parts of the world, large-scale die-off of forest trees, and we haven't seen that yet. But it's the kind of thing that it's kind of the terrestrial equivalent, one of the equivalents of a big storm or a big flood event, when an entire mountainside is covered in dead trees, people sort of step back and say, wait a minute, something's changing. And of course, sometimes this plays out through disease, as it has been impacting the North Bay, especially with sudden oak death. But the other factor that really draws one's attention to terrestrial ecosystems is when they catch on fire. Terrestrial ecosystems have been doing this for millions of years. It's not anything out of the norm, but it causes a lot of problems when we have developed areas and wildlands interlaced with each other. So a lot of native plants around here are very adapted to fire. This is one of my research areas, looking at how different plants either survive or even really depend on fire. But as we know, humans are not nearly so well adapted to fire. And this picture, I'm pretty sure from the South Lake Tahoe fire a few years ago. It actually shows a remarkable situation where embers get blown in onto a house that's poorly built, doesn't have good fireproof building standards, and the house would burst into flames and the trees are sitting in the not even burning. And you can go up to that South Lake Tahoe area and just see houses burned to the ground and another house next door is still standing, and the trees still standing. And a lot of that comes down to building standards. So building standards is a climate adaptation issue, fireproof building standards, because in hotter climates, fire becomes more vulnerable. The other top of the line issue, just quickly, what our models give us, fires are more probable in Southern California. They will continue to be more probable in Southern California. But as conditions change, some of these regions in the North Bay and very much in the South Bay get into the zone in terms of probability of fire that is like Southern California is now. So the Bay Area, towards the end of the century, if climate continues on a fairly steep trajectory, begins to look more like Southern California in terms of fire probabilities, and that would certainly be exacerbated if vegetation changes to the shrublands. And the other number one issue around wildfire is already an issue that becomes more important, is the land use and development. We know that the high costs of wildfire fighting come where houses are built into the wildlands and where the imperative to protect houses and protect human life, it exists, and that is what the fire departments are charged with doing. But fighting fire is, if not, it's either the first or second, along with water, most costly natural resource management investment in California, because it's an absolute imperative. We've already seen it this month. Already in May in Los Angeles, new fires already breaking out this year, and a huge mobilization of resources. So the land use codes that determine both the defensible space around houses and how far houses go out into the wildlands, that's a kind of adaptation issue as fire has become more valuable. One of the win-win strategies here is, of course, smart growth, bringing high-density human populations and very low-density wildlands, and that's good for a lot of other reasons, and it's already on a lot of plans because of the greenhouse gas benefits of reducing travel, bringing people closer to public transit, closer to where they work. But as I understand from yesterday's radio, these things aren't all going so smoothly, and I guess it was both San Carlos and Palo Alto that were in the news for neighbors being upset about the high-density housing going in near the train stations, because it's a change, and other people don't always embrace change, as we know. But there's no question that on wildfire, fuel consumption, open space conservation, on all those counts, that high-density growth is a smart strategy, certainly looking at it as an ecosystem ecologist. It's a smart strategy. So the most direct effect of temperature per se on people is almost certainly going to be heat waves and impacts on public health. And we've seen this is Los Angeles last year hitting 109. This is courtesy of Bruce, who saved this headline from 2006, one of the last really big statewide heat waves that had very strong impacts. And again, so here's a climate adaptation issue. Here's a community worker going door to door, looking for elderly people who may not have a way to get out of the house during heat wave and may not have air conditioning. And when it's hotter, the most vulnerable populations in heat waves is if you don't have air conditioning, if you live in urban areas, or I'll jump back, or of course farm workers who have no access to working outside. So farm workers and inner city low-income populations are by far the most vulnerable, and that's a climate adaptation issue, that vulnerability in the face of extreme heat. One way that is very effective to communicate about climate change, and we've seen this more and more in different brochures and documents that are being produced. If you tell someone it's going to be 2 degrees Celsius, that really helps, right? 2 degrees Celsius. Or even 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer 50 years from now. Like, well, that's not very much. The difference between an 80-degree day and an 83.5-degree day, that does not mean much. Now, those are averages, and those averages with that high is enormous. It's a really significant shift in the underlying weather. This is a different way of communicating it. If we say that the climate in the region of the Bay Area will be like the Central Coast in 30 years and like Los Angeles in 80 years, that is a much more intuitive and immediate way to think about overall climate and heat waves and those kinds of impacts. And that's a very useful way to communicate it. And one of the interesting things that's been seen in heat waves, this is from 2006, is the biggest increase in emergency room visits during a heat wave was actually on the Central Coast, not in the Central Valley. Because a lot of the impacts of heat waves is whether people are prepared for it. And again, so part of that is just air conditioning, and part of it is what people are used to dealing with, what they're used to living in. So heat waves are very much relative to the community. It's not only the Central Valley that will get impacted, although that is where the most deaths are seen, and especially that's related to exposure to farm workers. So if we look at caladapt.org, it's a resource at UC Berkeley, which brings a lot of climate data into a very easily accessible form. You can click here in San Mateo, and pull up a projection under one climate scenario. There's only one. There's a lot of scenarios. There certainly is uncertainty, not the kind of uncertainty that should paralyze us from thinking about how to act, because they'll all go in the same direction, certainly in terms of warming. If we take a baseline heat wave, in this case it's at around 85 degrees C, 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which might have occurred 5 to 10 times a year, and use that same threshold, and get up to the end of the century, and that could go up to as much as 2 months of the year under what we would consider heat wave conditions, at which point it's hard to call it a heat wave when it's the entire summer. But that's quite a shift, and again, that's a much more compelling way of thinking about it than just saying average temperature goes up by 3.5 degrees. But that really shows how those averages can play out when you look at these extreme events. Sorry, this is coming back to the air conditioning. This is a map showing the air conditioning incidence in the Bay Area, and the basic, a little hard to see the colors there, but all you need to see is that there's a lot more air conditioning in the eastern, inside the Coast Ranges, Solano County, and eastern Contra Costa, and you get towards the coast, and there's almost none. So that becomes a major climate adaptation component at the individual and at the large buildings. There's a lot more need for air conditioning than there has been in the past. Unfortunately, they all burn electricity. So that's not a win-win by any means, because that feeds back to increased fuel consumption. Another important adaptation strategy for heat waves is that urban trees reduce temperatures in neighborhoods. I think we all know this. Why do we go to the park on a hot day? Even in the middle of the city, parks are cooler. And that's a direct effect of tree physiology. When trees evaporate water to the atmosphere, they cool the ground surface. It's the same way that water evaporating through your forehead cools your body. Exactly the same physics. And there's a direct relationship. This is data from San Francisco. This is Sacramento. Between urban tree cover and neighborhood income. Low-income neighborhoods have much, much lower tree cover than high-income neighborhoods. So this adds to the vulnerability in low-income communities. And there's a number of things behind this, but in part it may have to do with financial responsibility for street trees, who's paying the bill, and what the incentives are for maintaining them. It has to do with perceptions of public safety or realities of public safety, that tree cover and vegetation can be seen as giving cover for criminal activity. There's a lot of different factors that come into the way people view and treat urban forests and urban forestry, but very much related to how climate can impact neighborhoods. And then the last one, and this is an area of research uncertainty. A lot of what protects us from extreme heat is the fog and the cool ocean, the upwelling along the ocean, these very cold currents that come up that keep our beaches so cold. This is an unknown right now. It is possible that the upwelling effects on the coast could become less extreme, so the ocean would be less cold, and that could exacerbate warming. It's possible upwelling could be stronger, and that could actually keep the coast cool, even as climate warms in general. And then as the cool air and the fog gets pulled in off the ocean, as the interior heats up, as the Central Valley heats up, that may actually increase that vacuum, that sucking effect of pulling the fog in, and that could provide relief for coastal communities, even in the face of increased heat inland. So this is very much a research, on the research agenda for climate scientists, because it's a very difficult problem to model coastal climate upwelling. It's a big part of our regional climate and one that we don't have a good handle on, in terms of especially very near the coast. Having said all that, and speaking of the Central Valley, the one thing that we do know is it will still be cooler here than in Fresno. By any measure, that's not going to change. And even as we might be concerned about greater heat in the Bay Area may remain and may become even more attractive relative to alternatives, relative to Southern California, relative to the Central Valley. So even having said all that, maybe this becomes, as climate warms in general, this could be something that draws people to the Bay Area, even more than all the things draw people to the Bay Area now. I think we may have a dual message that there's things we're concerned about, and yet the quality of life here may still, or may become, compared to alternatives, even more attractive in some ways. So these can push and pull both ways in terms of looking on the scale over decades. Okay, last we'll just touch on sea level rise, and this is one that you've probably seen a lot, maybe people who are quite deep into the sea level rise problem, and it's one that impacts San Mateo, obviously very strongly. Sea level rise is underway. This is something, it's not that we've had a flat sea level and suddenly the climate is warming. We've seen already about 8 inches of rise in the 20th century, but as both warming the atmosphere, which warms the water, and warmer water expands, and then we add to that the concerns about the melting of Greenland and Antarctica, and the big uncertainty is how fast those ice caps may melt. That is a very, very difficult climate problem. So it still leaves us, this is actually maybe a little bit of an old slide, in that, if anything, some of the uncertainty about how fast sea level rise is going may have increased with continued research. And certainly some of the high scenarios, that's up to 2.5 feet at the end of the century, and some of the high scenarios They may be very unlikely, very low likelihood, but they're well above 2.5 feet at the end of the century at this point as possibilities. The concern is not mean sea level, which is shown here at the bottom, but the extreme high water events. And these are the actual recorded highest water event on a mean high water, when you combine a high tide with the sun and the moon aligning and get especially the exceptional winter tides. And of course, one way we often think about these is return times. Talk about a 50-year storm or a 50-year tide event. Unfortunately, those terms are going to become rapidly, completely obsolete. Because the main message here is that a tide event that might have returned every 50 years soon will be returning every 10 years, and then every 1 year, and then every month. And so what we've used as these benchmarks will become more and more frequent and then routine once you get a higher baseline sea level. Some of you, I'm sure, have been following the King Tides project, which is just getting people to go out and photograph the highest events as a way to get us thinking about what does it look like? What does it look like when the high tide is spilling over the Embarcadero there in San Francisco? And then this one you all know better than I do, the San Francisco Creek flooding at Christmas, which I guess caused some near heartaches, or maybe real heartaches, and near crises. And I think this was, if I'm right, was this a combination of rainfall and the high tide? Is it right down, or is
No,
it more?
it was mainly rainfall.
This is mainly rainfall. I was wondering about that.
If we had had the king tide at the same time, we would have been in really
Okay.
much bigger trouble.
So and this comes back to that point about the flooding of streams and rivers when combined with increased sea level could really exacerbate events at the coastline. Again, a map that many of you may have pondered before about what if you get up to 55 inches of sea level rise. So now that's now at 4 feet. So that's certainly a high up on the scenario. It's just not as unlikely as we might like to think if we're looking at it, especially if we're looking at it 100 years. And then combine that with an unusual storm at a high tide, and the blue area is showing all of the impacted areas around the bay begin to hit enormous areas. All of that, again, a lot of my interest is in open space and conservation, and a lot of that just comes down to the sense of quality of life. What is it that draws people to the area? What is it that draws a lot of the businesses to live here? And it is the fact that people like to live here. That's, of course, what keeps unfortunately, our cost of living so high. It's just is that quality of life. And at some basic level, that is the question for me around climate change. When you put together all these different pieces, it is a question of what would it take to maintain or minimize the impacts on quality for those of us who live and love the place. So this, I know you can't see the contents here, and we can talk about them more, but this is from the California State Adaptation Guide, and it's just making the point I started with. There's a lot of actions we can take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of actions that can be taken that reduce the impacts in terms of climate adaptation. But there's a big overlap in the middle. A lot of it is around energy conservation, making systems more resilient. A lot of the kind of maintenance, which, I'll stop with that. It's a long list, and it's worth reading to think about. So there's a long list of actions that goes beyond just that focus we've had on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I just want to thank a lot of colleagues. As I said, this is not at all, this is not my research, this talk at all. They're drawing from a lot of folks at Berkeley and others. A lot of research has been funded by the state. California Energy Commission has been a real leader in getting a lot of work done at a regional and statewide scale, which gives us this kind of information. I want to thank Bruce, who's helped pull all this together. And I think I'll pass it over and we'll wait and do
Questions?
We're
Yeah,
hungry.
you want to take some down?
I'm happy to take questions if
Yeah.
we can stay on.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
So the focus on San Mateo County, do you have projections specific to San Mateo County on inundation projections in the next 20 to 50 years? My understanding is properties east of 101 will primarily be, with the current projections, significantly a lot of inundation there. So I wondered if you could focus more on San Mateo County, sort of the east of 101 scenario.
Sure. So first of all, I don't have, I did not pull specific slides, and in part, I think there's a fairly significant initiative which may be coming in the next 6 months locally to really dig into those maps. And as I said at the outset, it's the least of my areas of expertise and the things we've talked about here, so I don't want to go beyond what I'm responsible to speak about. There's no question they exist, though. I think it's the answer. So the question is, Bruce, what would you say is the best sources right now?
BCDC has developing new maps and with NOAA new sea level rise viewer. You know, the bottom line for San Mateo County, it's one of the most at-risk counties of any of the 9 we have in the region, and one of the most at-risk in the entire state. Obviously, it's going to depend east of 101, as you were asking, which projection we're using. Are we using 16 inches? Are we using double that or triple that? And that's the big uncertainty.
Was anyone here at the Silicon Valley, what was it, Silicon Valley 2.0?
2.0.
I did not attend that. Because I know that there's the group that working at Santa Clara County, it was also pulled in a lot of BCDC maps to get into it.
We can get you afterwards hooked up with those that have that more detail. Okay?
Yeah.
If I could just quickly comment, I mean, that's why I'm here. Because I did attend a sea level rise specific event up in Pier 39 hosted by I forget who. And so,
Bay Institute, yeah.
so whoever was there said, you know, state of California says we plan for 55 inches by the end of the century.
Right.
Plan for that, 4.5 feet. And given your graph about weather events, probably every 2 years you get a storm that creates twice that surge. And so for me in the city of Burlingame, I'm looking at serious flooding within 30 years. And as I said at the outset, that's 1/3 of my tax base.
Yes.
And personally, as a taxpayer, I think you rebuild the New Jersey boardwalk once. I think you rebuild New Orleans once. I don't think you rebuild them twice. And that, so I have very serious concerns about that. And given the amount of money, so I'm like very interested in what San Francisco Airport thinks it's going to do. That's what I think I probably have to do.
Question. So is the 55 inches above the base flood elevation?
Wait, say that again.
Is the 55 inches rise, is that above the base flood elevation?
The 55 inches is the rise in mean sea level in the 100-year event. You know, we had a discussion on this yesterday, but I think the language is going to get a little mixed up. I mean, there are 100-year event, there is not a 100-year tide event. It's an unusual storm.
Yeah.
Whether that's even a 100-year event.
Like the 100 years don't have the base flood.
Yes.
Is 55 above that? Is that what you're saying? Is it cumulative or is it just
It's a double effect. There's no, yeah.
above the base flood?
It's a storm coming in on top of the, it's a storm coming in on top of the sea level. Yeah. What's, yeah.
I used to be a fan of the Bay Area, but I have been in global climate change for the last 3 years. And just out of affection and loyalty, looking at the global climate here. And it seems to be all based on a trend on factors that are already known. And none of the plans that I've seen is very clear even have adaptation for the potential change in the playing field, such as positive feedback from oceans that would start us into a cycle of increasing burden, and worse, it's biofeedback. So we're going along trends of current producers of carbon, but not putting the warning signs, and I know probably because there's still a lot of unknown, but not putting the warning signs that at an instant when Arctic tundra releases the methane, all of these projections will go down because we're just going to go into a different trajectory, potentially exponential, potentially geometric. So, yeah, adaptation goes by the known, but we know that there's a big unknown, and none of the adaptation plans are even ready for that. We have to keep track of the methane release in the tundra that is starting, and the shale of this recently and also it's been going long, it's not a 2 degrees, it's a 1.5 degrees. Wrong, it's not a 10-year horizon, it's a 10-year horizon or less. Or Russian scientists say it's too late. There's methods already. So, in the local plants, yes, you have to go by your intent, but you also have to speak up on potential spikes and what will put us to the next level of temperature, right?
Well, I would absolutely agree in the sense that I think part of the challenge, of course, is some of the higher, more extreme climate change scenarios, even if we're not sure, or even if they're low probability, become almost paralyzing. In which case, maybe they're not useful unless they're right. I mean, that's kind of the dilemma. Because if they're right, and then it's like, well, why do we want to spend all this money on X, Y, Z if it's not nearly enough? On the other hand, if they become paralyzing, they don't necessarily help us do things that could still be useful.
But they're trickling in now.
But they're getting more.
Evidence of.
Well, and certainly pay attention to the IPCC, which every 5 years releases these major reports. The new one will be out in September, October. So the whole baseline discussion about these scenarios will shift at the end of this year as everyone moves on to a new platform. At least, now those are still a little more consensus than some of these factors. But hold on to this, we may want to go back. Maybe one more.
Do one more.
So I work with Supervisor Dave Pine, who's very interested in sea rise. I was actually, I didn't see you there, but I was at the same event at Pier 39. We had the opportunity to meet with a climate denier, which was interesting. And the question I have is, when you go back to that graph where there's the sea level rise, it sort of splits out, that one there. The farther out, obviously, than everyone I talk to, the farther out you go, the wider the unknown goes. One of their comments was, and they were using NOAA maps and that sort of thing, and they were making a comment that carbon level, CO2 increase has been increasing more at a quicker pace than global temperatures. So they were trying to make an explanation that CO2 and temperature rise are not necessarily correlated. What was your response to that? And they, I've been going with looking at the back of the charts that they were showing us, but it's not that I believe in that, but it just isn't.
So the first response is if all of this was built on correlations, none of us would be as confident. If we just say, gosh, every time the CO2 goes up, the temperature seems to go up. But the physics is there too. The way CO2 traps long-wave radiation when it bounces off sulfur. And the reason we call it the greenhouse effect is just like when you go into your car on a hot day, right? Light comes through, once it warms things up, it re-radiates as long-wave radiation. Glass traps long-wave radiation. The car gets hot. If it bounces back as light, we just go right back to the car. Right? So same thing happens in a greenhouse. Same thing happens on the Earth because clouds and CO2 are like the glass and trap long-wave radiation. So the physics has been known actually since the 19th century. And that, I think, just makes it.
So you're saying there is scientifically, factually,
yes,
there is a correlation.
CO2 does.
CO2 and
yes.
temperature are.
That when CO2 goes up, it will trap more heat in the atmosphere. And then having said that, there are these times in history where temperatures seem to go up before CO2 went up because of the feedback effect. Because if something else drives CO2 up, it changes the biochemistry of the ocean or changes ecosystem processes. And sometimes CO2 does follow temperature. And that has given a lot of people leverage. Take it in and say, oh, it's a weak argument because it doesn't always lead, the CO2 doesn't always rise before temperature rises. It must not be a sound argument. But it's really kind of a false logic because, but in complex systems, and we all know this, it's like, think of a ship tipping over, or think about any kind of dynamic process where you start getting into an argument about which thing happened first, right? What caused the ship to turn over? You can keep backing up down the chain to get to the first event that began to get it to tip before it went into an unstable event and flipped over into this new state. And it's a little bit of that kind of debate where since you can always go back one step, you try to poke holes in it.
Because one of their comments was that the temperature rising has not been increasing over at least the last 10 years.
Right.
The graph that we've shown before with the temperature definitely shows over a 100-year span. They were saying over the last 10 years that actually temperatures have been
And that's true, and it certainly is a challenge to the modeling often, but also there's a lot of factors in the global climate system on decadal scales that slow or hasten rise, volcanoes and things.
So they're not necessarily going to tell.
They're not coupled at a year-to-year scale. They're coupled over decadal scales, which makes it pretty hard to deal with in climate dialogue.
David.
Okay, we should keep moving. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you,
One
Dave.
more chance for discussion too, right after Bruce Reardon.
Good job, David. So Bruce Reardon, climate consultant for the Bay Area Joint Policy Committee, and we're building a narrative at the JPC, a story that we think will be a more science-based and compelling story for the Bay Area. And David's really gone through the first two parts of that, and I'm going to do the third. The first one being that we're already seeing changes in the climate and effects of that in California and in the Bay Area. The second being that many things that we love and depend on here in the region are in increasing danger as we go through the next couple of decades. The third, which I'm going to focus on, is there are plenty of things that we can do here that will make a difference. This is one of the differences between doing GHG reduction, the climate mitigation work, which you, in the end, have to do it globally. What we do here won't matter if others don't do similar things around GHG reduction across the country and across the globe. But adaptation, you can actually take on here and do quite a bit to a certain level. You can do quite a bit. We have many solutions here, and I'm going to show you a few that people are working on already that will make a real difference. So, anyone seen a BioLite stove before? This is post-Sandy. So they had whole tables of these going in neighborhoods that were without electricity for 4, 5, 6 days. These are camping stoves. They're wood burning that produce electricity, and so you can make coffee with them and charge your phone at the same time. So they were a big hit in places that were again without electricity for a while. You know, in terms of things we do, you've seen these lists before. For GHG reduction, it's electric vehicles and public transit and transit-oriented development and renewable power and energy efficiency. And those are the kinds of things we work on, strategies here in the Bay Area around GHG reduction. Around climate adaptation, and David touched on some of these, you know, we have a series of things we're looking at in the Bay Area: sea level rise, extreme storms, heat waves, and all. And down the line here are some of the things that we're looking at or starting to assess in terms of the kinds of things you could do for sea level rise, sea walls, wetlands, armoring, retreat, for heat, emergency plans, cooling centers, for big storms, stormwater management, infrastructure strengthening, water and energy conservation. And again, I'll underline what a point David made, one of the big points here on adaptation. We're doing a lot of these things already. We have to do them somewhat differently with climate impacts, or we have to do them at a greater scale, or we have to maybe spend more on them. But there are a lot of things that are already the kinds of things we do to make our communities resilient. These are the three numbers these are really the only three numbers you need to know in climate change right now. 2 is 2 degrees Celsius. It's pretty much the agreed upon international target that we have, that we're trying to stay under that additional temperature rise versus, did we do that?
No, but the AV system apparently works now.
All I had to say was 2 degrees C. So 2 degrees C is again, as David said, it's one of those numbers, and it's overall temperature. This is a more interesting number. 565 gigatons. It's the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can emit in addition from today forward before we get to 2 degrees C. So this is a dangerous threshold. This is what we will have to emit to get to that dangerous threshold, and that's about 15 years worth of emissions at this point in our history. It will take a little longer to get to 2 degrees C additional, because there's a lag in the system, but the emissions to get there, we're going to get there and boom, go right by it in another 15 years. Because we show no signs globally of making any change in the emissions path that we're on despite all of the talk now for 10, 15, 20 years about making a change in greenhouse gas emissions, nothing's really shifted globally. We're continuing to do 2 or 3% a year. This is the bigger and scarier number in gigatons. Again, this is the emissions that would go into the atmosphere of GHGs if we burn all the coal and all the natural gas and all the oil that we know of, the known reserves in the, and again, we're headed towards that number as well. So this is why, and the reason I put these up here, this is why we have to do both adaptation, because the impacts are coming, and we have to do GHG reduction. If we just stick to adaptation, which is what we're talking about today, and deal with the impacts will eventually overwhelm us, or overwhelm our children. At some point in the future, the impacts will be too hard for San Mateo County to adjust to, or the Bay Area to adjust to. So we've got to get off the emissions path we're on and be dealing with adaptation at the same time. So around the country, there's some great news. Other regions are basically ahead of us, a number of them. And these are screenshots and reports from New York, DC, San Diego, Baltimore, Chicago, places that have really taken on now climate adaptation planning in a very structured and major way. They're all doing it somewhat differently. Everybody's got a kind of a different cookbook to it. But a number of regions around the country are taking on climate adaptation, and we can learn from them. We always think of ourselves as leaders. In this case, we're going to learn from some of the regions that are ahead of us. Baltimore is doing theirs all through hazard mitigation planning, through that approach. New York built theirs into their great sustainability plan, the Plan NYC. Chicago built climate adaptation, again, into a bigger sustainability plan for the city and surrounding areas. Our challenge, and we'll talk about this later, is that we don't have a dominant city to take on that kind of thing, and a mayor to stand up, one mayor, and say, we're going to do this and we'll do it for the region. That happened in New York, that happened in Chicago, that happened in DC. We have a different region here and a different challenge in terms of getting that kind of leadership. So here's our org chart for the Bay Area. It's pretty flat. The good news is these are all groups that are working in various ways on climate adaptation right now as we speak. So while we don't have an organizational structure like New York has, or Baltimore, or Chicago, or Southeast Florida, we've got a lot of groups who are jumping in. I'm going to show you some examples of things they're doing. BCDC has led the Adapting to Rising Tides project. This is on the east side of San Francisco Bay, from the Bay Bridge down to the San Mateo Bridge. It's been a major undertaking involving hundreds of stakeholders to understand how we have to all work together, cities and counties, water districts, transportation providers, NGOs, public health departments, on down the line, dealing with sea level rise and extreme storms along that part of the bay. And so BCDC is now, after 2 years of working towards these goals, of both assessing what the issues are with their partners and assessing what are the best strategies to use. They're starting that work. The ART project, as it's called, will be now, these are some of the players that have been involved in ART, it's now going to be replicated in some other parts of the bay. We don't have the money right now to do it completely around the bay, but BCDC is certainly working now with funding partners and with the Coastal Conservancy and all to take this major project and expand it and replicate it elsewhere. So that's probably our biggest project. We did an inventory of about 90 projects that are out there right now in the 9-county region on climate adaptation. And probably a third of them have to do with sea level rise and extreme storms and coastal or bayside flooding. It's the biggest category. If you want to Google this one, these are all, we have an inventory with web links that I can make available, so that can get out to all of you. This is an interesting one, the ART storm scenario, 500-year storm, 1,000-year storm, and they ran a whole, USGS ran a whole project to look in California at what the on-the-ground impacts would be of this kind of a storm with the kind of infrastructure and population we have now. Very interesting and scary project. Public health departments, anyone from San Mateo County Public Health here? Yes, hi. So public health departments are in various ways around the region getting involved here. As I remember, San Mateo County, you've put this into your climate action plan? No.
Climate action.
Into the climate action plan, so public health impacts and all. This is a project that State Department of Public Health is going to do to help build the capacity of our county public health departments around assessing climate risk, mostly around heat and air pollution issues. City and County of San Francisco is one of the few that's taken on a big CDC-funded project on public health called the Climate Ready Initiative there. So there's starting to be some action now on the public health front. It's probably our biggest gap in the region between need and resources. So everybody has a gap, every sector working on adaptation. I think the public health gap there that we need to fix is probably the greatest one. Water agencies are doing a tremendous amount, including yours here in San Mateo County. And David kind of touched on this, of the different ways that we get our water, and so the different ways that we'll have to deal with this in terms of adaptation. Districts that are getting local supplies from the Sierra, McCollum, and Tuolumne watershed, and from the state and Central Valley projects. The Delta is going to be a huge issue for all of us, whether your water in San Mateo County comes from the Delta or not, because we're tying systems together and we won't let one part of the Bay Area go while another one continues to have water. But the Delta has been called one of the top 5 or bottom 5 targets for trouble for climate change and earthquakes both in the entire country. We are so vulnerable here in the Delta for California's water supply and much of the Bay Area's water supply. So the Delta is a major issue. And there's a lot of work going on that. PG&E, we just had a 2.5-hour meeting with PG&E a couple of weeks back. They're doing a tremendous amount in terms of strengthening their infrastructure. The impacts for PG&E are strong storms, sea level rise coming, a loss of hydropower in the Sierra, those kinds of impacts. Certainly heat, which draws a demand on their system. So PG&E is doing quite a bit now on adaptation. The good thing on the side of energy is that we've got 2 parts. You can strengthen the infrastructure, and people like PG&E are working on that. But you can also do all this work on energy efficiency and on renewable power. And so all of the work, this is one of those crossovers that David showed on his diagram, all of the work that's being done here on energy efficiency, on making buildings more efficient, and on increasing our use of renewable power, those are not only GHG reduction strategies, those are local resilience strategies. We will be in better shape if we've got a more efficient use of electricity in this region when there is less of it due to storms, due to declining snowpack or other reasons. Transportation, Caltrain's doing some on this. BART is doing quite a bit right now. Capital Corridor, looking at their own infrastructure, where their tracks are, what the risks are from mainly again from storms and sea level rise, but also from heat. So transportation agencies, SFMTA has a whole adaptation plan at this point, looking at their, again, assessing their risks. A few more. On the natural system side, we have what I wish we had for every sector. We have the Bay Area Ecosystems Climate Change Consortium, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's BAKE. It's one of my favorite acronyms. And BAKE is a consortium, as the name implies, of 30 different groups. I think now they're closer to 40, working in the ecosystems areas in the region. David is a member, and various groups who came together around these issues. They said, look, there are 30 of us, and we're all fighting for the same funding and looking to see kind of the same kinds of things around climate change in a county or in an area having to do with natural resource protection. So they formed a consortium and got more foundation to fund a coordinator. It's really, again, the kind of thing that we're hoping to see in other sectors where we can pull together these working groups to move ahead. And finally, there are a number of community-based organizations around the Bay Area who are now looking at climate change as an added impact on their communities, on vulnerable communities. Bay Localize has their Community Resilience Toolkit, which is quite good on all of this. And this is really all about building community resilience from the ground up. Again, If we can spend the money now and the time now building more community resilience, we will do better when we have big events happen or the long-term changes. There's some interesting research done on the Chicago heat wave mid-90s that looked at similar neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods in Chicago, and how they fared in that heat wave, in which there were a lot of heat mortality and a lot of hospital visits and all. And the neighborhoods that did better, even all across low income, hold that constantly, the neighborhoods that had social cohesion, and neighborhoods that where neighbors knew each other, where there were strong neighborhood organizations, where people checked on people, they had much lower rates of all the bad things that you would get from a heat wave. So community resilience is going to be a big part, and also organizing in these communities, from those communities, not from the top down, but coming from the various more vulnerable communities that we have in the region, and getting those communities involved in the planning from the get-go. So that's all for, those are just some examples. Again, we have an inventory of more than 90 projects that I'll make available, and it's the good news. We don't have a structure yet for the Bay Area. We're going to talk about that a little later. And I'll just throw this up now for a teaser for later. These are some of the challenges that we're looking at structurally. Again, we have to take it as a plus, but it's also a barrier. 101 cities and 9 counties, hundreds of stakeholders involved. Financing very difficult in today's environment for climate adaptation. It's not seen yet as an economic imperative for the region. We haven't told that story in a compelling way yet. When we do, things will start to move around financing. We aren't very good yet at getting good science to decision makers and a clear, kind of agreed upon scientific story. Some of your questions got at that. Other priorities. It's not that people in this region are climate deniers too much. It's just there's too many other priorities right now that people see as more important. And collaboration and compromise are always difficult, but we'll work on that.
But I think the solutions are really good. So we actually picked the top 3 barriers. We had a tough time picking just 2. So the top 3 barriers were funding, the complex geographic layout of the shoreline, which means there are fingers of land that jut out in the shoreline, and it's going to be a tough decision whether you decide to protect some of them or all of them or not any of them. So just that complex geography. And then the third barrier is the need for long-term solutions and the political will needed for those. Oftentimes the payoff doesn't happen for 20 or 30 years, but the pain happens now. So politicians and decision makers might have a tough time committing to some of those long-term solutions. The solutions that we chose were number 1, regional coordination to share ideas and to get the stakeholders together. And then also finding consensus on the priority issues and finding the common ground. I think that's also regionally. And really getting to know what has the most benefits. Some local jurisdictions may need to give up some local control if they realize that it's for the greater good and for something that has a greater benefit regionally. So those are some of the solutions.
Thank you. Do you want to pass it to Michael over there?
Thanks. So I wasn't taking the notes, but I'm going to do my best to synopsize a very robust conversation among everybody. As with the prior group, clearly funding is a barrier to solutions. And then I think we also believe that the perception that either climate change isn't real, which does still haunt a number of people, or that it's just a very long-term issue. And we have pension benefits we have to worry about, and we have sidewalks we have to fix, and we have a lot of things we have to do before we have to worry about this. So those are 2 big barriers. In terms of solutions, and I'm going to try to tease out a consensus, I hope the group will agree with me. I think there was a general consensus that there really are 2 different buckets of issues. One is climate change broadly, and the other is sea level rise specifically. And I think we felt that there was a real difference about how you handled those 2 things. So with respect to climate change, we really feel more education of residents and people, and frankly, probably everyone doing a little bit is a lot more important than the city of Burlingame converting to electric vehicles, that every single house needs to make a difference for greenhouse gas. But when it comes to sea level rise, which is an adaptation strategy, that really doesn't matter what the person in Burlingame Hills thinks. It does matter what BCDC does, or the city of Burlingame, or the city of San Francisco. So adaptation is probably a local government, regional government solution. Greenhouse gas, if that's where we think is the biggest game changer, that's probably an education effort. So we want to reach out to communities on greenhouse gas reduction, to teach everybody how they can do their bit and insulate and use less energy. But on the adaptation part, we want to identify who's driving it and what needs to happen and what kind of investments need to be made.
Thank you. We centered on barriers to climate change impacts. So we had a pretty long discussion about the first one, which was connecting risk to the market regarding real estate. One of the examples was Pete's Harbor. So issues regarding insurance coverage, who does the informing? So we actually spent quite a bit of time on that whole barrier. So the second one is barriers to climate change. Lack of accountability by elected officials. So getting information, who's going to actually be accountable. And then the third, so we were actually supposed to do the top two, we were sort of focusing on those. And then the last, need for proactive risk assessment. So a couple of our solutions were some more discussion about insurance coverage, more education, better target education regarding real estate. And then town of Portola Valley actually talked about issues regarding building codes. So one of the ideas was solution to improving building codes specific to issues regarding fire-related issues from climate change impacts. So that was our discussion. Thanks.
So we had a couple of themes when it came to the barriers. The first one really is related to, with the disappearance of the redevelopment agencies, changes in staffing, fewer staff, and also, where to house this kind of work in the city necessarily under those kind of circumstances with small cities. And then, staffing in general, and those sort of tied together. The other side of it, was the funding, which of course is tied to staffing, but also in terms of priorities, where cities right now are putting their priorities where they're using their money. And I think in San Mateo County, it was pointed out that San Mateo County has a lot of very small cities. You don't have, I think Bruce sort of alluded to this, we don't really have one large city like New York City that's can take all the burgs around it, but sort of lead the effort. So we have a lot of small cities, yet in adaptation you have issues that are more regional. And so how do we have voice? And I guess maybe this workshop is part of a little bit of a voice here. So on the solution side and tied to that really is identifying the county level leadership, or who would be the people who would sort of bring together the different stakeholders to feed information to the regional discussion, and then creating something that instills a sense of urgency, and of course that also sort of ties to mandates. I guess the survey said that we're really not, asking the state to say that we mandate things like it was in Santa Clara County, but the thought was that if there, adaptation planning became required elements in the general plan, or hazard mitigation plans, or some of the various plans that sort of end up being reviewed and looked at the state level, if adaptation was tied into those, that might be part of the solution.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Okay, we're going to move into part 2 of our afternoon. So Michael, why don't you come up? Michael McCormick has joined us from Sacramento, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, to talk about planning approaches.
Hi everybody, thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. I've been in about 15 or 20 of these around the state over the past year or two. There's a lot of people having the same discussions that you are. Who in here is familiar with what OPR does? aside from CEQA. So we're really the local government liaison to the state. We perform a function that nobody else really does in the state. We have a handshake capability between agencies and departments that nobody else really has. So one of the things we've been really focusing on, because the governor has really shown a lot of interest in this and sees it as one of his largest priorities, is climate change, particularly around the risks and hazards piece. So we've been working with our other agencies and departments within the state to really help understand how we can move forward together. I think if any of you have worked with the state in the past, particularly on climate change, you've found that departments and agencies don't necessarily say the same thing about anything in particular. Maybe it goes beyond climate change as well. So I didn't bring a PowerPoint today, but I did want to outline some of the things that's going to be happening through the rest of this year and early next year, because it really has a really significant impact on how local governments will be moving forward on climate change. One of them is the general plan guidelines update. It's in process right now. We have a unifying theme of climate change throughout the general plan guidelines update. One of the big things that you may have noticed if you've looked at the last guidelines, which I don't know if anybody in here has read the 300-page general plan guidelines. Oh, Tammy has. I would expect Tammy to have read the entire document. But we're shortening up the general plan guidelines pretty significantly, linking it out to external resources. But one of the big things we're doing that was not included in the 2003 update was climate change. There's not a single reference to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, acknowledgement that climate change exists. 2003 doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was 2 years before the governor's order S305, which established the state's emission reduction targets. So we've made a lot of progress since then, and a lot of the documentation that both provides guidance for local governments and guidance internally for the state doesn't necessarily reflect that fully. So we're in the midst of a transformation in our guidance documents, both internally and externally at the state. The end of this year, early 2014, you're going to see climate change in every single major guidance and policy and program document from the state. We're attempting to unify these discussions as much as possible and really try to minimize the impact on local governments, linking the resources back to regional efforts and pulling them back up into state efforts. So this is a lot of what I've heard already today is, okay, maybe we don't need a state mandate, but really local governments are already mandated to deal with climate change impacts, if you think about the impact side, because it's a safety and hazards issue. It's already something that's required in the general plan guidelines. It may not be called out explicitly, but it really is already there. We have a lot of regional collaboratives that are forming to really create these conversations, and Bruce has been doing a fantastic job here in the Bay Area. We've been working with a number of other regions throughout the state, San Diego, LA, and Sacramento regions through a newly formed group called the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. It's a great forum for talking about what the state's doing, what the regions need from the state, and how we can translate what the state's doing into really resources for the regions that are working on this issue. From the survey, I've really noticed that this county in particular is looking to the region for leadership, which is great. We've talked to people all throughout the state, and we get responses from, get out of here, we don't want the state at the table, all the way to, well, we really don't have the resources at all to even talk about this, so we really need state leadership, guidance, technical tools, resources, and funding to actually make this happen. So we're attempting to deal with all those different perspectives and how we coordinate these resources and guidance documents. Funding came up a number of times. This is one of their big issues that we're looking at. We understand that climate change adaptation is going to cost a lot of money in the future. It's going to cost a lot less if we do it now rather than in the future, but it's still going to cost a lot of money. We've been working with the Council on Environmental Quality through the White House, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, working with California Emergency Management Agency, and working with foundations and partners in the rest of the United States to bring some of these resources to bear on this problem in California. And I think we're going to see a lot of progress on that front over the next year or so. Cap and trade is one mechanism a lot of people are looking at to provide funding for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And the question comes up pretty frequently on whether we can use that for adaptation. The it's a complicated question. The clearest answer is no, but also acknowledging that there's lots of greenhouse gas emissions reduction projects that also benefit adaptation. And one of the things Bruce mentioned is the linkage back to renewable energy, which is also one of the governor's top priorities. Renewable energy clearly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but by establishing microgrids and distributed generation within your own communities, you're also building resiliency within your community to the potential impacts of climate change, whether it be extreme storm events that may knock out power. If you've developed a local energy assurance plan through the Cal LEAP program, which CEC launched last year, there's a lot of different mechanisms to really build resilience in your community. And some of those also have the mutual benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. One of the other major documents that's being updated right now at the state is the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. This is where a lot of those conversations are happening with the federal government through FEMA and CEQ. But we're also linking those discussions back to the general plans because we acknowledge there's a really strong link between those discussions around hazard mitigation and safety hazard elements in general plans. We're able to link those two together, and we're developing resources and tools to be able to make that a lot easier. One tool that came out last year was the Adaptation Planning Guide, developed by Cal Poly through Cal EMA and the Natural Resources Agency. This Adaptation Planning Guide provides a process for doing an adaptation plan. It also provides some resources and guidelines for policies and programs that you can put into place. But we're really going to be looking to that to provide structure around the general plan guidelines discussions and linkage back to the state hazard mitigation plan, and really guidance for locals on how to deal with adaptation impacts or climate impacts and adaptation issues in their community. I don't want to take up any more time. I think there's probably going to be some questions, maybe one or two, and I'd love to be able to respond to some of those from the state perspective so that you can get a better feel for what we're working on and how we're trying to coordinate things at the state level. Is that okay? Do I have a few minutes for that?
The cap and trade, somewhere next year or a year after will go into international projects. However, the mitigation that can be brought about by international projects is much more effective than mitigation that's here. For example, Duke University says blue carbon is the best absorber of carbon. If we could replant 1.2 million hectares of tropical mangroves, we turn carbon around. It's a big problem to do that, but still, if the solution is so good, then, would cap and trade California look into that? Because then it's a very efficient mitigation.
Right. Well, so the question was, should we be also looking at international emission reduction programs that are funded through cap and trade rather than just California-specific reduction programs? And I think the response to that is that we're not just looking at cap and trade as a mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're also looking to it as a mechanism to change the market of energy production and transportation so that we're changing how California operates top to bottom from a carbon intensity standpoint. If we think about the really significant goals by 2050 for our emission reductions of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, that's going to require an 85, 89% reduction in emissions from just the transportation sector to hit that 2050 target. And that is a transformation in how we get around. Whether it's electrification of the grid, which also requires a transformation of the energy system, all the way down to vehicle-to-grid technology and really transformative stuff that we're not even aware of at this point that's going to be happening over the next 20 years. Well, there's got to be more questions. Mike.
So you guys are also working on California and 50, right? And so how does that effort tie into the other plans and efforts and guidelines?
So most of our planning efforts in the state and at the local level have been in 20-year increments, sometimes 5-year increments. With climate change, we have to think much further out. So the question was, we have an initiative within OPR that we've been working on in coordination with the governor's office about California in 2050 with 50 million people. We have 38 million people now. It means 12 more million people. Our infrastructure is already stressed at this point. We're going to see some significant new stressors as climate change occurs, and we're seeing more and more impacts. So how do we deal with that? And this is one of the reasons why we're incorporating the discussion of climate change into all of our program and policy documents. There's an acknowledgement through our infrastructure funding, through our Department of Finance efforts to develop the infrastructure plan, through infrastructure funding that's being provided to regional governments and local governments, that there needs to be a decision-making process that considers climate change and climate change impacts. We don't want to be putting infrastructure in places that are going to be impacted in the future. And we certainly don't want to be putting in infrastructure that doesn't apply to the new transportation realities that we're going to be facing after 2050 to respond to greenhouse gas emissions. So it goes back to the idea that by 2050, we really have to transform what we're doing from both a transportation and land use standpoint to accommodate our target reduction goals and the effects of climate change.
In regards to sort of the updates and working within the risks and hazards framework, is there going to be any updating in terms of identifying sensitive receptors and vulnerable populations that might align with kind of like the EJ screening method?
Yeah, we have an effort in place right now. OPR is also one of the leads on environmental justice in the state. So we've been coordinating closely with EPA, Cal EPA, on the EnviroScreen tool that was used to help prioritize some of the funding for cap and trade. But there's also an acknowledgement that that can't be used for everything. It doesn't quite have the level of granularity that we need, particularly from a CEQA standpoint or for a proactive planning standpoint. But it is a good guidance mechanism for funding. So we are working on that right now. It's not, and you know what, in the long run, it's never going to be totally settled. That's going to be something that needs to be worked on continually over time. From an environmental justice standpoint and from an equity standpoint, climate change is going to hit those of us that are really most vulnerable the fastest. And it's going to hit them the hardest.
Can you give a quick update on the climate adaptation strategy? First came out with Schwarzenegger, and I understand Governor Brown's office is doing an update. What's the status of that?
Sure. The 2009 adaptation strategy is being updated. There was an internal draft that was released last year, and we found that there was some significant interconnections that were needed between sectors that weren't in that draft. So we're going through a full revamp right now. We anticipate a public review draft out by the end of the year. And the adaptation strategy, it's really important to note, is really focused on state agencies and departments. So although it does affect local and regional efforts because of funding linkages, decision-making frameworks, criteria around funding, it's really focused on the state efforts. The general plan work, the adaptation planning guide, the forthcoming climate action plan technical advisory, which will be out publicly next month, from OPR, is really focused on the local government perspective and regional coordination efforts. So it's important to track the adaptation strategy effort and respond to it and comment on it when it comes out public. But from a local regional perspective, staying plugged into the OPR efforts is really important. And actually one of the best ways to do that is on the OPR website. There's a tab at the upper right-hand corner which has a list of email lists. The climate change email list is the best one for climate-specific stuff, but I'd sign up for all of them because we have lots of good stuff coming in.
I'm actually on one of those email lists, and I saw an email about an urban heat island tool. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
So there's a new guidance document out from the California Department of Public Health that was coordinated with EPA, and OPR was part of that discussion, providing guidance on urban heat island from a perspective of a health standpoint, which when you look at it, make sure to understand that it is focused on a health standpoint. So there's infrastructure impacts that might occur as a result of urban heat island and extreme heat that aren't necessarily reflected in there, like buckling of rail lines and roadway issues and wildfire, things like that. But it talks a lot about the linkages back to the health side. There's also a recent guidance document out from Caltrans, MPO guidance on adaptation, which includes pretty significant discussions on the urban heat island. The general plan guidelines will also have discussions around urban heat island and think about that in context to the rest of the local planning priorities. And all of those can be found on the climate change portal, which is climatechange.ca.us. You're welcome. But I'll be around, so if anybody wants to talk with me afterwards, feel free to connect with me. Maybe I'll give you my contact information since I'm out of cards.
Okay.
And you can circulate it. My door's open, my email address is open, so feel free to contact me at any time with questions. Thanks.
Okay. Bruce is going to come on back up and talk to us about the regional effort that's bubbling.
So our project regionally, covering the 9 counties, has some funding from the Kresge Foundation and from the Joint Policy Committee to do a 6-month needs assessment. And we talked with about more than 100 stakeholders, some of them in the room today, around the region as to 3 questions. What are they doing on climate adaptation? And this was public, private, nonprofit, the whole range. What are you doing was one. What do you need to move forward? Similar question to one of the ones in your discussion groups. And the third, what are the things we have to do together? You know, we start looking at this as to, there's a lot that can be done at the local level, but what are the things that we have to band together on, not only just in this county, but from county to county, maybe in sub-regions or maybe even in the 9 counties. And 4 things came to the top, and again, I'll send you the documents and you can link to them if you want. One obviously was funding. Dedicated funding for planning. We're trying to nickel and dime what is a big problem here to be dealing with. If we don't throw some better resources at it, we're going to continue to just kind of scratch our way along. And that's tough these days to find, but in some fashion we're going to have to mount a campaign here to get some dedicated funding for cities and counties and others to do some of this work. We're also going to have to, at the same time, and people recognize this in the interviews, be more efficient. How can we use existing resources for planning to take on some of the climate adaptation work now? Second thing was that people said, come talk to my board, come talk to my boss, come talk to my funders. Come out with a story that's a compelling and science-based and good story and a narrative for the Bay Area, and give me some support within my organization by talking to those that control funding and control my work plan and all around climate adaptation and why we have to do this kind of planning now. Why can't wait for another 5 years or 10 years. The third was give us more information about projects that people are doing, because as we found a lot of projects in the region, why reinvent the wheel if somebody's already invented the wheel somewhere in Sonoma County or in San Mateo or in Santa Clara? Let's help people find that information in a quick and easy way. Not another website where you have to go wade through 150,000 different things, but actually kind of more a personal approach to linking people together. And the fourth was give us better science. Or we have a lot of good science out there, but we need guidance really as to how to use that science and which information to use. There are a lot of conflicting or even non-conflicting stories, but just stories out there in the science that we've got to help people boil that down to something that we can all use, those of us not in the science community. So from that, we've created, and there's some others, but those were the kind of top 4 on the needs assessment. We've created a proposal now for a Bay Area Adaptation Center, and we're in discussions with Kresge and Joint Policy Committee and a number of others to get this. Our goal is to get this up and running in the fall by September. I'd like to get it running sooner because we need to get going. But I think September is a realistic goal. And these are some of the things that would be under this kind of heading of Bay Area Adaptation Center. And again, this is about helping cities and counties and others who are working to move forward and to accelerate their work and to finding those things that we need to do together. So there'll be a coordinating council, kind of an interim structure for the region. We'll get to more permanent ideas in a minute. But a coordinating council where we can pull the water agencies and PG&E and key cities and counties and all together, and we can start understanding where we're strong and where we're weak in the region, identifying issues that need to be, this will be a staff level group, so we're not going to be creating policy, but we're going to be identifying clearly policy changes that are needed and funding and other things that are needed to move forward. And then extension type services will be, this is the going out and working with people who are doing projects and helping them understand who's done something similar, where partnerships could be formed, bringing the science to people so they can understand more easily what the science is that they could be using in a particular area. Again, some of the questions about science for San Mateo County here. And again, making this simpler. Right now you've got to phone 100 different people in the region trying to find what's the projection I ought to use for this or for that. We want to boil that down and make that more accessible given the current information. This is the come talk to my boss, come talk to my board. We're going to be targeting certain elected officials and leaders in the region in different segments of the 9 counties and going after them to increase their support for adaptation planning, increase their support for the things that we need like dedicated funding and all. There will be a vulnerable communities initiative that we've proposed as part of this where we would focus more resources on certain geographic areas in the region and particularly organizing those communities around community resilience. We've proposed at least, and it may survive as we get this funded, a microfinance fund. We don't want this to be, this isn't big government and top down. We want this to be encouraging innovation in the region, and there's a lot of innovative thinking already on adaptation. And Michael mentioned ARCA and the state. This coordinating and adaptation center would give us kind of an official link that we could link to other regions that are working around California. So those are some of the things that we're proposing. And again, we're in conversations now to get this funded so that we could start the work by the fall and give I would call an initial structure for the region that can help us all move forward, because there are always going to be many players. This is not going to be a clean looking thing, and that's good. So let me go back one. So while we're doing all of these things, and this is again kind of staff level work, we're feeding issues up to kind of executive level. We're identifying big issues, but here's where we're one of the issues that is going to be dealt with at a higher level. And I'd be interested in your quick feedback on some of these. These are possible structures that we could use in the region, and in no particular order. So for organizing adaptation planning in the region, right now in the state we have AB 32 for GHG reduction. We didn't leave that up to everybody just to kind of do something. We passed a law and we have goals, and there are certain things that are being done. Same thing with SB 375. Same thing with the renewable portfolio standard. On the adaptation side, we're still back a ways, and we don't have at this point legislation or mandates, but they're coming. I think it's safe to say. So one way you could do that would be to amend SB 375 and the Planned Bay Area Plan, which is now the first one working towards approval next month, could be amended to include climate adaptation. And climate adaptation planning could become part of that process. Again, I'm not advocating on any of these. These are just ones that are under discussion. Hazard mitigation planning is something that's getting a lot of looks. And around the country, this is now, people see there's a lot of overlap. It's not complete between adaptation planning and hazard mitigation planning. And we do a lot around earthquakes and that kind of hazard mitigation work here. Maybe we could fold the climate adaptation into the FEMA, state, county hazard mitigation planning. Been mentioned here, local government general plans may be one of the best ways to institutionalize, again, adaptation planning. Certainly on certain topics under adaptation, the local general plans may be the best form. Climate action plans, some include adaptation, and that could be a bigger push on that. We're very interested in why we're here today is this idea of counties. Cities, there are just too many right now to be dealing with, but a 9-county kind of approach would start to get at some of the impacts in a better organized fashion. We probably have to, in looking at these different choices, do something different for different impacts. Public health and heat and all can probably best be organized at the county level with county health departments and all. Sea level rise, obviously, as we've talked about, those things move across county lines. Fire, interesting. We'd have to look at them somewhat differently, but counties could be very, very helpful, we think, for being organizing tools, or maybe 2 counties together even, or 2 or 3. We could do a Bay Area sustainability plan, not amending SB 375, but you could do something like what New York did, or Chicago, or DC, where adaptation is part of something greater, which I think is a very good integrated approach. In the DC plan, economic development is right in there. There are goals for climate adaptation, GHG reduction, economic development, jobs. It's an interesting plan if you want to look at that one. The DC Sustainable Plan is called, pretty new. We could do a sea level rise plan. There's a lot of feeling in the region that this is what we ought to focus on instead of trying to do all of it together at this point. Allow the other issues around adaptation to proceed in various ways. Water agencies working on water, energy agencies working on energy, but pull everyone together to work on sea level rise and extreme storms and the coastal and bayside flooding, because it is our biggest challenge, and it is our biggest challenge in terms of governance, in terms of land use issues. There are issues around those other adaptation topics, but there's a lot of discussion going on right now that will continue as to maybe we should focus here to start and then bring in some of the other items as we go. There's kind of a back and forth going there. Just one point while I got that on. Land use is going to be a big, and I heard this in at least one of the groups in walking around. Local land use decisions, and this one, are going to be a very difficult set of challenges for us. And we don't have to solve them today or tomorrow, but that's what this is a lot going to boil down to, is to who makes decisions as to what gets developed and what we retreat and allow to flood, where we armor and where we strengthen. If one city in San Mateo County does it and the next one can't afford to, what does that mean in terms of where the water goes? Because water obviously won't care. There are similar issues around heat and fire and energy use and water use around land use. So for instance, water agencies are in charge of providing water for us, and they're all working right now. It's heartening to watch how much they're doing in terms of understanding climate change in the Sierra, in the Delta, in local water supplies, and what they have to do to build for the future. Conservation programs, efficiency programs, maybe new infrastructure, all of those things, even desalinization, all those things that are kind of on the table, reuse of water. But water agencies don't control who lives where and which city chooses to take on 10,000 new people. Do we put the next million people in the Bay Area that we're adding to the Bay Area over the next 20, 25 years, do we put them in the hotter outer regions of the Bay Area where they're going to use a lot more water per capita? Or do we put them in the central part of the Bay Area and more infill growth? Same with fire. David made the point yesterday when we were talking in the East Bay in terms of, and he showed it in his slides here. Fire we can do a lot of things in terms of protecting ourselves, but if we build at the fire interface, that's a choice about land use that cities and counties make. And if we do it, then there's only so many things you can do to protect yourself from fire after you've made those land use decisions. And the same with energy use. We can do a lot about energy efficiency, and we have to. We can do a lot about energy, about conservation, and we have to, and about renewable power and all. But we're going to increase demand a lot more for a stressed energy system if we put people, again, in areas where they're going to need more air conditioning and more energy use. So land use is going to come in. Again, we don't have to solve all this today, but those are really going to be the tough issues for a region that has 101 cities and 9 counties and hundreds of special districts, and we make these decisions city by city, county by county. Couple other choices here. Anyway, that's all on possible structures. That's probably using my time. I take any questions on this, and thanks for your patience. Yes?
Do you know if there's been any research done on the fiscalization of response to climate adaptation? By that I mean, you talk about building at the wildland fire interface, and an acknowledgement that there is limited or reduced fire suppression in those areas, or if you're within the effects of sea level rise, that there is a limited or controlled response from first responders. It may not be very politically positive,
But is there anybody talking about that or discussing that?
Some. I think that's where we need to go. I mean, dollars and cents is what, you know, the overall national figures, this is a kind of an answer, is $1 spent on adaptation generally translates to $4 saved in terms of damage control and after the fact. So 1 to 4, that's pretty good. Now, we can't find the 1, you know, often, and so we're going to end up paying the 4. I would answer that by saying there needs to be much more research on this, because I think, again, turn this into an economic issue and an economic imperative.
I just think about it from the standpoint of people drove last when gas was plus $4.
Yes. Yeah.
So until it becomes a really, economic or fiscal issue,
Absolutely.
it doesn't necessarily drive the.
Sure. And a couple of you mentioned this earlier, insurance is going to play a huge part in this. I mean, again, these are all about kind of public sector mechanisms that we would use. But I think, as we all know, the economics of most of these issues often drives much more what result we get. So looking at flood insurance, fire insurance, looking at a whole set of things that could really move things in a direction. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment about if you wind up creating a new government coordinating entity or whatever this is, I'll just make an observation as a relative newcomer to council. So I've been on council for 3 years. And when you send a council member to a body, you get really only a faint report of what that body is doing. We're all busy, we have other priorities, et cetera. I'll tell you, if you send a regional representative, so North County gets 1 seat, South County, then you have no idea what's going on. So I really strongly advise, if you create a body like this, that you strongly encourage each city to send 1 council member and 1 staff member. I'm lucky to have Kevin Gardner here from our planning department. I really think this is not going to be solved in 1 year or 5 or 10.
Yeah.
And I really think having continuity both at the staff level and the political level, cities don't have to show up, but if they don't even have a seat at the table, they're not going to come and sit in the audience.
Good.
So that's just a recommendation.
And I gave the quick overview here. We're looking at this coordinating council as being something that would go county by county and not just sit in Oakland or wherever we happen to be. And expect, again, in 9 counties that people are going to travel to there, that we can do web-related meetings, and I would see us coming to each county to get more detailed back and forth. Thank you.